Our last slideshow ended with the battles of Lexington and Concord, which are widely recognized as the opening battles of the Revolutionary War. What we're going to look at now are the opening stages of the Revolutionary War, and also look at how American leaders and British leaders respond to these early phases of the war. The video goals. By the end of the video, you should be able to explain how American and British leaders responded to the opening phases of the war, and how escalation of violence led the Americans to consider declaring independence. Your vocab is also listed. Make sure you understand what those words mean. So after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the American militiamen are able to trap the British Army in Boston. This means that the British people can only get supplies and send messages via the ships in Boston Harbor. The British eventually try to escape from Boston, and when they do this, it results in the Battle of Bunker Hill. How it works is that the Americans had taken up a position on this hill that blocked the exit from Boston. So the British had to take this hill if they wanted to escape. But during the course of this battle, the Americans inflict heavy damage on the British troops. The Americans have dug fortifications in the top of this hill, so it makes it very hard for the British to attack them. And while the British are marching up the hill, the Americans display pretty decent discipline and actually stand their ground and fire volleys at the advancing British soldiers. Supposedly during the battle, one of the commanders issued the famous order, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes," which demonstrates both the determination and the discipline of the American soldiers during this battle. Eventually the British do kick the Americans off of the hill, but they still fail to free themselves from Boston. They remain trapped in Boston, and they suffer very heavy casualties. This is an important battle because it gives the Americans confidence. It shows them that they can stand up to the British, and it also really angers the British king, which leads him to pass a number of measures that we'll talk about in a few slides. While this battle for Boston is going on, the Second Continental Congress is also happening. And this is a bigger deal than the First Continental Congress. Leaders from all 13 colonies meet back up, so Georgia's there this time, and more important people are there. So John Adams and George Washington have returned, but other leaders, people like Ben Franklin, have also joined. So this idea of colonial cooperation is spreading, and it's catching on. One of the first things that they do is they write up and sign something called the Olive Branch Petition. And what this is it is a formal offer of peace to the British king. What they say is if the British will just get rid of the new taxes and all of the oppressive laws that have been passed in the last couple of years, then they could go back to having peace. The British reject this offer. They're determined to tax the colonies. Another thing they decide is not to declare independence. They decide what they really want is to remain British subjects, but with the same rights they had before the French and Indian War. They also vote to fund an army and a navy. The idea here is that even though they don't want to be independent, they're willing to resist the king militarily until the king gives in to their requests. And finally, they select George Washington to lead the Continental Army. This is important for many reasons, one being that George Washington is an awesome leader who ends up leading the army to victory, but it's also important because George Washington comes from the South. Remember, he's from Virginia. And by selecting a person from Virginia to lead the army who is up in New England, it is a symbolic gesture of unity between Southerners and Northerners in resisting the British. So after George Washington takes command, the Americans succeed in taking Boston and kicking the British out. The first thing that happens is that some Americans capture a British fort called Ticonderoga, on the other side of New York. And this is very important because this fort has heavy cannons, the kind of cannons you need to attack a city. So Washington has the cannons transported from the fort all the way to Boston, and they set the cannons up on a hill overlooking the Boston Harbor, which means that they can destroy any ships that go in and out of the harbor, and that means that they could starve the British out of Boston simply by blocking off both their land and their sea exits. This results in the British retreating to Canada, leaving Boston unharmed. They agree, what happens is the Americans agree to allow the British to leave Boston if, in return, the British don't burn the city down as they go. So the British go away, they get away unharmed, and they leave Boston standing. And this is seen as the first major American victory of the war. In response to these American victories, the British King George III is pretty upset. And in response to this, he decides to escalate the conflict. Rather than backing down and giving the Americans what he wants, he decides to amp up the violence. He's going to come down hard and force them to give up and give in to the British rules. And the first thing he does is he accuses the American troops and American leaders of treason, which is a crime punishable by death, and not just death, but a really terrible death that involves torture and beheading and stuff like that. Treason is basically just when somebody is rebelling against the king. And so clearly they were guilty of treason, and George III is just saying the way things are. But besides that, George III also begins burning down important American port cities. He has the British fleet show up, destroy a city, and leave. Basically no questions asked. And last of all, he hires an army of 30,000 German mercenaries to fight against the Americans. And a mercenary is just a soldier who fights for money rather than for any particular country. And these German soldiers had a terrible reputation as being very brutal soldiers, and they were nicknamed Hessians by the Americans. All three of these actions that George III pursued show the Americans that peace is no longer an option. George III is committed to defeating the Americans militarily and then imposing British law upon the colonies. This also leads many Americans to begin to see independence as the only available course of action. They've already tried rebellion, or they've tried offering peace, offering terms. George III wants none of it. So in response, they start to think that maybe they should just go ahead and declare independence and try to fight to become their own nation. We'll see in the next slideshow how this idea is taken up and turned into a much bigger idea by thinkers like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. The goals for your video: make sure you know this stuff. Yes. See you tomorrow.